Something genuinely special is happening at the Allen Park practice facility right now, and after watching everything that came out of mandatory minicamp and OTAs this offseason, it has become genuinely difficult to find a single legitimate hole on this Detroit Lions roster. That is not hyperbole. That is not blind homerism. That is an honest assessment after going through every single position group, watching the practice reports, and recognizing that this organization has assembled a roster that looks every bit like a championship contender on paper. And the fact that we are saying this after a 2025 season that felt clunky, that felt uncertain, that had this fan base genuinely wondering whether the magic of the recent playoff runs was starting to fade, makes this current moment feel even more significant. Let us start with the surprise signing that grabbed headlines this week, because it is a small move with an interesting story attached. The Lions added 3 former UFL receivers to their roster, including Tariq Black out of Michigan, Lucky Jackson, and Tay Martin. Black in particular is a name that deserves a moment of recognition because he is the kind of player whose story tends to get lost in the shuffle of NFL roster movement. He was a talented receiver at Michigan who never quite got his real opportunity at the professional level and ended up bouncing through the UFL trying to keep his career alive. Is there genuine room on this Lions roster for him to make the active 53? Probably not, given how deep and talented this receiver room already is. But there is something genuinely nice about an organization giving a player like that another look, another chance to compete, another opportunity to remind everyone why he was good enough to play at Michigan in the first place. These signings might end up being nothing more than camp depth, but they reflect well on how this front office continues to scour every possible avenue for talent. Now let us get into what actually matters, because the practice reports coming out of minicamp have been genuinely staggering in terms of the talent on display. You read through the highlights and it almost becomes comical. Jared Goff to Amon-Ra St. Brown for a gain, then Jahmyr Gibbs breaking off a long run, then it is somebody else making a play, and then somebody else after that. The sheer accumulation of talented players making plays in practice creates this overwhelming sense that this roster simply has playmakers stacked at every single level, and that depth is showing up in the most unexpected places. Consider this detail from the closing days of minicamp. Blake Miller took first-team reps at right tackle. Ennis Rakestraw was working with the first-team defense at cornerback. These are not necessarily the players you would have circled as locks for starting roles heading into the offseason, and yet here they are, getting meaningful first-team reps and showing the coaching staff enough to warrant that opportunity. Meanwhile, the second-team offense, led by veteran backup Teddy Bridgewater, was performing well enough to generate genuine positive buzz of its own. Bridgewater connecting with players like Dominique Davis and Greg Dortch, the receiver brought in from the Cardinals specifically to fill the kind of slot role that Khalif Raymond occupied for this offense in previous seasons, shows that even the depth pieces on this roster are capable of executing at a high level. And then there is Jackson Meeks, who continues to be one of the most pleasantly surprising storylines of this entire offseason. Meeks caught a touchdown during one of these practice sessions, further validating the decision he made to add weight and transition to tight end after a direct conversation with Dan Campbell following last season. This is a player who was buried on the wide receiver depth chart with little realistic path to a roster spot and who has now transformed himself into a legitimate fourth tight end option with real receiving ability. That kind of organizational player development, identifying a specific skill set transfer opportunity and then executing on it successfully, is exactly the kind of thing that separates good front offices from great ones. The safety room provides maybe the single best illustration of how deep this roster has become, and it deserves to be highlighted specifically because of the context surrounding it. The Lions currently have 2 all-pro caliber safeties, Kirby Joseph and Brian Branch, both dealing with injury situations heading into the 2026 season. That should be a crisis. That should be the kind of situation that completely derails a defense's outlook for the year. And yet, because of the depth this organization has built at the position, the Lions remain 4 deep at safety even with their 2 best players currently unavailable or recovering. That is an almost unheard of combination of elite top-end talent and genuine functional depth. Most teams that lose their best 2 players at a single position are looking at a significant downgrade. The Lions are looking at a unit that, while not operating at peak capacity, still has enough quality and experience to function at a respectable level until the top of the depth chart returns to full health. The special teams unit also deserves real recognition because it has quietly become one of the most underrated strengths on this entire roster. Jake Bates connected on what looked like a 64-yard field goal during minicamp practice, and reports suggest his leg has the strength to potentially reach 70 yards under the right conditions. Combine that with Jack Fox, who has established himself as one of the better punters in the league, and the Lions have 2 legitimate elite-level specialists handling the kicking and punting duties. When you start adding up every single position group on this roster, offense, defense, and special teams, the honest question becomes genuinely difficult to answer. Where exactly are the holes? If pressed to identify one area of legitimate concern, the most honest answer points toward the development timeline of the younger pieces along the defensive line, specifically whether Derek Moore can contribute and develop faster than some projections suggest. But even there, the depth behind Aiden Hutchinson remains genuinely strong, with at least 3 players capable of stepping into significant edge-rushing roles right out of the gate. That is not exactly a glaring weakness. That is a quibble about development timeline on a unit that already has multiple credible contributors. Now let us talk about the 5 players who most impressed throughout OTAs and minicamp, because each of these stories deserves individual recognition for what they represent about the overall health and direction of this organization. Chuck Clark deserves to be the headline name in this conversation. This is a player who was a starting safety for the Pittsburgh Steelers, who has played in 123 career NFL games, and who the Lions brought in this offseason specifically to provide veteran stability and leadership at a position that desperately needed it. If Kirby Joseph cannot play, or if Brian Branch's recovery timeline extends further than hoped, Chuck Clark is a legitimate, proven starting caliber safety in this league. That is not a backup plan built on hope. That is a backup plan built on a player with a verified track record of performing at the position when called upon. Lions fans should genuinely appreciate what this signing represents for the floor of this roster's outlook at a position that carries significant uncertainty. Amon-Ra St. Brown is the second name, and honestly, when has he not impressed? St. Brown is entering his absolute prime as a receiver. He has led the entire NFL in receptions over the last 5 seasons, a statistic that gets mentioned often but rarely receives the full appreciation it deserves. This is a generational talent at his position, and Lions fans need to actively work against the natural human tendency to take greatness for granted simply because it has become consistent and expected. Enjoy this. Enjoy every single season of prime Amon-Ra St. Brown, because players of this caliber do not come around often, and this organization is lucky enough to have him locked in for what should be several more elite seasons. Rock Ya-Sin is the third name worth highlighting, and his re-signing this offseason deserves more credit than it has received. The grading data and the underlying performance metrics from last season showed that Ya-Sin was playing at a genuinely high level, performing like a legitimate starting caliber cornerback rather than just a depth piece keeping the seat warm. Combine Ya-Sin with the continued development of Ennis Rockestra and Terrion Arnold's progression, And this cornerback room has the foundation to be genuinely good, provided the health concerns that have followed several of these players can finally be put to rest. Jimmy Rolder is the fourth name, and his story might be the most fun to track of anyone on this entire roster. A fourth-round draft pick out of Michigan who came out of seemingly nowhere during a chaotic and controversial stretch for that program, Rolder has continued to impress throughout the offseason program. He intercepted a pass during minicamp, standing at 6'2" and 240 pounds with the kind of natural anticipation and reactive quickness at the linebacker position that simply cannot be taught through coaching or scheme. This profile, a player who emerged from relative obscurity to immediately produce at a high level, has the makings of one of those classic mid-round draft steals that ends up looking like a tremendous value pick in retrospect. And finally, Jackson Meeks rounds out this list of standout performers, continuing the story we touched on earlier about his successful transition to tight end. The competitive dynamic this creates at the bottom of the wide receiver and tight end depth charts is genuinely interesting, particularly for a player like Tom Kennedy, who has consistently shown flashes of legitimate ability throughout his time with this organization, but has never quite secured a permanent roster spot. Kennedy is the kind of player who makes plays when given the opportunity, but who keeps getting squeezed out by the sheer accumulation of talent this front office has assembled at the skill positions. It is a genuinely strange and slightly unfair dynamic, but it speaks volumes about how competitive this roster has become from top to bottom. Beyond these five standout names, it is worth stepping back and appreciating the broader collection of elite talent across this roster. When you actually count up the positions where the Lions can legitimately claim to have one of the best players in the entire NFL, the number is staggering. The best tight end in football. A top 3 defensive end conversation that includes Aiden Hutchinson. The best left tackle in the game. One of the best running backs in the league in Jahmyr Gibbs. A legitimate case for the best middle linebacker. And St. Brown's case for being the best receiver in football, full stop, not just in conversation, but genuinely at the top of the list. That is potentially 6 positions where this roster features a player who belongs in any honest conversation about the best at what they do in the entire National Football League. That kind of concentrated elite talent across so many different position groups is exceptionally rare, and it represents years of patient, disciplined roster building finally coming together at the exact moment this franchise needs it most. Aiden Hutchinson appears fully recovered from his injury and ready to operate at the level that made him one of the most feared edge defenders in the league before the setback. Alim McNeill continues to develop into a legitimate force along the defensive interior. Cade Mays has shown real improvement at the center position, addressing what was a genuine question mark for this offensive line. Malcolm Rodriguez provides reliable depth and competitive toughness at linebacker. Greg Dortch continues to build chemistry within this offense. Derek Barnes continues working to take the next step in his development. When you put the entirety of this roster picture together, the conclusion is genuinely exciting and should give every Lions fan real reason for confidence heading into the 2026 season. This is not a team hoping things break right. This is a team with legitimate, proven elite talent at multiple positions across both sides of the football, with the kind of depth that allows it to absorb the injuries that inevitably come during a long NFL season without completely losing its competitive ceiling. The uncertain, clunky feeling that defined parts of last season has been replaced by a roster that looks every bit like a genuine championship contender on paper. Now it just has to translate that talent and that depth into results on the field when the games actually start counting. Lions fans, the comments section is yours right now. Which area of this roster, if any, do you see as the biggest concern heading into training camp? Do you agree that this might be the deepest, most talented roster this organization has fielded in the modern era? And which of these 5 standout players from minicamp are you most excited to watch develop further once the pads go on? Drop everything you have got below, hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel for daily Lions coverage all the way through training camp and into what should be a special 2026 season. Let's go Lions!